Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Welcome to Cineversary, a podcast that celebrates a milestone anniversary of a masterful work of cinema. Each month we send happy birthday wishes to a different film currently observing a joyous jubilee. That's everything from a 20th all the way to a 100th anniversary. I'm your host, Eric Martin, creator and moderator of the Cineverse Film Discussion Group that meets weekly in the Chicagoland area. This month, we'll take a trip through the murky shadows of the 1940s and the seedy side of Los Angeles film noir, as captured so brilliantly in director Billy Wilder's Double Indemnity, which turned 75 years old this year. But birthday parties are only as good as the guests invited, of course, so I made sure to invite the foremost authority on noir, Eddie Muller, host of Noir Alley on Turner Classic Movies, president of the Film Noir Foundation, and author of several acclaimed books, including Dark City, The Lost World of Film Noir. Eddie and I will delve deep into the dark world of Double Indemnity and explore why it's worth celebrating all these years later, its cultural impact and legacy, what we can learn from the picture today, how it stood the test of time, and more. Prior to introducing Mr. Muller, how about we learn more about how this month's film came about and where it ranks with some facts plumbed from Wikipedia. Double Indemnity is a 1944 film noir crime drama directed by Billy Wilder, co-written by Wilder and Raymond Chandler, and produced by Buddy DeSilva and Joseph Sistrom. The screenplay was based on James M. Cain's 1943 novella of the same name, which originally appeared as an 8-part serial in Liberty magazine beginning in February 1936. The film stars Fred MacMurray as an insurance salesman, Barbara Stanwyck as a provocative housewife who wishes her husband were dead, and Edward G. Robinson as a claims adjuster whose job is to find phony claims. The term double indemnity refers to a clause in certain life insurance policies that doubles the payout in rare cases when death is caused accidentally, such as while riding a railway. Praised by many critics when first released, Double Indemnity was nominated for 7 Academy Awards, but did not win any Oscars. Widely regarded as a classic, it's often cited as a paradigmatic film noir and as having set the standard for the films that followed in that genre. Deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant by the U.S. Library of Congress in 1992, Double Indemnity was selected for preservation in the National Film Registry. In 1998, it was ranked number 38 on the American Film Institute's list of the 100 best American films of all time. And in 2007, it placed 29th on their 10th anniversary list. It currently holds a 97% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes, where its average critical score is a stellar 9.01 out of 10. Now feast your ears for a moment on the movie's original trailer.
I killed Dietrichson. Me, Walter Neff, insurance agent, 35 years old, unmarried, no visible scars. Until a while ago, that is. Yeah, I killed him. I killed him for money and for a woman. It all began last May. I was thinking about that dame upstairs and the way she had looked at me. And I wanted to see her again, close, without that silly staircase between us. How could I have known that murder can sometimes smell like honeysuckle?
I can't stand it anymore. What if they do hang me?
They're not going to hang you, baby.
It's better than going on this way.
They're not going to hang you. Because you're going to do it and I'm going to help you.
Yes, from the moment they met, it was murder. But always behind them, with his devilish hunches and his brilliant brain, was Keyes.
The murder's never perfect. Always comes apart sooner or later. And where 2 people are concerned, it's usually sooner.
Could they get away from him and his relentless pursuit? And could they get away with murder?
You don't know Keyes. Once he gets his teeth into something, he never lets go. He'll investigate you. He'll have you shadowed. He'll watch you every minute from now on. You afraid, baby?
Yes, I'm afraid. But not of Keyes. I'm afraid of us.
I'd like to move in on her right now, tonight. If it wasn't for Norton and his striped pants ideas about company policy, I'd have the cops after her so quick it'd make a head spin. Now, we know the Dietrichson dame is in it, and somebody else.
Only you haven't got a single thing to go on, Keyes.
He'll show. He's got to show. Sometime, somewhere, they've got to meet.
Okie doke, before we bring Eddie aboard, note that there are lots and lots of spoilers ahead. So if you've not yet watched Double Indemnity, hey, it's your civic duty to pause this podcast, view the film, and come on back. All caught up? It's my pleasure to introduce our special guest for this month. It's our Czar of Noir, acclaimed author and host of Turner Classic Movies Noir Alley, Eddie Muller. Eddie, welcome to Cineversary, and thanks so much for agreeing to be our guest.
It is my pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, it's such a treat to be able to talk to you. I couldn't think of a better, more appropriate guest. I thought, who can I have that's going to really know this movie back and forth? And immediately, Eddie Muller. It's got to be him. So thanks again for saying yes.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
So, Eddie, when and where did you first see Double Indemnity, and why is this movie important to you?
That is a good question, and it's funny. There are some movies where I can absolutely recall where and when I saw them, and then other ones that are like slipped into the ether. I honestly can't remember where I saw this movie the first time. It would be a safe bet to say it was on television.
Okay.
Because I used to comb, TV Guide to find all those movies that I realized I loved, and would stay up late, because I'm old, I predate video cassette recorders and stuff like that.
As
so
do
you
I.
actually had to watch them when they were broadcast on television.
That's right.
But there were, I grew up in San Francisco, and there were an incredible number of repertory cinemas in San Francisco. And I know that at some point I saw the film on the big screen back in the 1970s. That was when I would have first seen it. Probably at the York Theater or the Surf Theater or the Cento Cedar Cinema or the Richelieu. All of these were, I don't want to necessarily call them art houses. They were like rep houses that showed these films regularly. And it was a tremendous cinema education for me. And the film is important. I mean, for me personally, it's obviously the film that I always point to and say, well, if I had to show one film to people to explain to them what film noir is, this is the one that I would show. So obviously It has that personal significance for me. But I do just think it's a landmark in Hollywood history. It is in terms of film overall, internationally and everything, it is a very important movie, but specifically I think it's important in the development of Hollywood because it so challenged the production code, and it changed people's expectations of what storytelling could be, where the protagonists didn't have to be the good guys or the heroes of the piece, and that was extremely important for the development of film noir.
Absolutely. And it should be said, of course, that it wasn't the first true film noir. I mean, a lot of historians point to, for example, The Maltese Falcon and some others. And this is 1944, and really the cycle, by many historians' account, begins, 1941 or thereabouts. But, to your point, it is probably, what would you say, the most important up to that point in terms of ushering in the whole style and template?
Yes, I think it is, because whereas the Maltese Falcon certainly represented kind of a noir ethos, and Sam Spade was not necessarily a hero. He operated outside the law. He didn't represent the law, which was kind of a crucial thing. But that's different than having the bad guys be the protagonists of the movie, which was a major change.
Wasn't that true of the gangster genre, though, which preceded this?
Yes, but in the gangster genre, that Warner Brothers particularly specialized in, they were professional criminals. I mean, they were morality tales about, social forces driving people to become criminals, all an offshoot, really, of the 20s and Prohibition and all that. And I don't think the average person watching the movie is going to say, yeah, I wish I could be a bootlegger and become a criminal.
I see.
But these
Yeah.
movies were different. They were just about, I could steal the money from the till, to because I want this woman, and I mean that Double Indemnity has the classic line, I did it for a woman, I did it for the money, and I didn't get the woman, and I didn't get the money, and that's kind of what it's all about, right?
Sure.
So I think that these movies definitely showed average citizens in America as being capable of this stuff, right? I mean, Walter Neff is an insurance investigator,
Exactly.
He's supposed to represent, stability and the system. And that's one of the things about the movie that I love so much is that Walter is really I've always thought of him as kind of a terrorist in a way, because his interest in doing what he does in the movie is more about gaming the system.
Yep.
And proving that his mentor is wrong about all this empirical evidence that people do this and that and blah blah blah, and he's like going to throw a wrench in the works. And it's less that he's truly enthralled to Phyllis than he wants to prove that he can get away with it.
Yeah, there's an arrogance, a smugness there that I'd like to talk about in a little bit, which kind of defines his character a bit and adds a theme to the movie. But that's a fascinating take on what makes Neff tick.
The other really important thing about Double Indemnity is that it was a hit. It was a big hit when Paramount did not think it was going to be. They really took a chance with Billy Wilder saying, no, I want to make this movie. And the fact that the public responded to it, and it, if there's going to be a trend in Hollywood, and as I like to say, an artistic movement, it's got to make money.
Sure.
Right? There's no artistic movement is going to come out of money-losing movies. So the fact that Double Indemnity scored at the box office and was a critical success and was nominated for a bunch of Oscars, that's why it is the most significant film in the development of this movement we now call film noir.
Thank you for the perspective. No, the context is fantastic. But just for my part, I first caught Double Indemnity in a great film noir class in college. This was probably about 30 years ago. And it blew me away at the time. This stylized world, the hard-cut characters, the memorable crackling dialogue, the finely chiseled plot, the nihilistic ambiance. And from that watch onward, I knew I would always love this genre, film noir. I was just a fan from the word go. But it was really this movie that kind of clinched that for me. So, Eddie, why is Double Indemnity worth celebrating 75 years later? How has it stood the test of time, and why does it still matter?
Well, it has stood the test of time because it, like I say, it changed everything. You now could make a movie in which the protagonists of the film were essentially the bad guys, and Billy Wilder taught the studio executives and the American public that there's a squirmy pleasure in that. You are going to pay the ultimate price at the end, because it wasn't like they were bucking the production code in the way they were treating this material, but they still weren't going to get away with it at the end. So that was very, very significant. And it's funny, Eric, you mentioned seeing this film in a class. Sometimes I am actually invited to speak in classes, high school and college level classes.
Okay.
And this is the film that I don't show the whole film, but I show clips from Double Indemnity, because I have found that of all the noir films, it's the one that connects most readily with younger people.
Why do you think that is?
Because it's about sex. I hate to be so blunt about it, but it's true, right? I show them the scene where Walter and Phyllis meet in her house, and I ask them, what do you think this scene is about? And kids get it. Sometimes they say what it's about rather crudely, but it leads to my explaining, yeah, you're absolutely right. That's what it's about. He wants to get with her, and oh boy, there's a lot of steam developing between them, but they're fascinated by how it can't be so obvious, that there was a language that had developed that was used, all the innuendo and all of this stuff is fascinating to a lot of young people because they don't know anything about the production code.
Right.
They don't know anything about the rules that governed Hollywood at the time. They just thought stuff was corny because it was corny.
Yeah.
You know, and then you show them Double Indemnity or a lot of noir films, and you say, this is dead serious, right? I mean, these people are going to plot a murder to kill her husband, and you've seen this movie in a modern version, but this is the progenitor. I mean, this is where it came from. And then they're fascinated to learn like how artists had to skirt the production code.
Yeah.
And how they had to couch things and how this really meant that, and which is very intriguing. You know, it loses some kids, but other kids are really fascinated by that, and I have found that this film is a great way to introduce younger people to classic cinema because there's nothing nostalgic or corny about it. Once you get past the super stylized language, which either puts people off or completely entrances them,
Okay.
then they buy in. And I'm sure that one of the reasons I got my gig on TCM is because somewhere in the early talks with them, I had made the comment that film noir is the gateway drug to classic cinema. And I've been doing this for 22 years now, and I find that to be absolutely true.
Wow.
That young people are drawn to noir films before they're drawn to screwball comedies or westerns or, historical dramas of that time. Or, noir connects in a way that those other films don't.
Do you think it's because of the more adult situations, the kind of subdued sexuality? Is it just the fact that it's a little more credible of a template, even though it's many decades old?
Yes, I think that's a big part of it. That the stories hook you immediately because they're kind of life and death stories. Desperate people doing desperate things.
Okay.
And everybody can quickly relate to that.
Yeah, and there's a lot of cynicism and pessimism and nihilism in these movies, whereas you do have a lot of cornball and sentimentality in a lot of other films of the classic Hollywood period, which could turn more modern generations, younger viewers off. Would you agree? Is there something to that?
Yes, I totally agree with that. And I think that it's easier for younger people to see, relate to these films and there's a corollary with movies today. They'll watch a crime film or something like, I don't know, Sin City or something like that, and they can see the corollary. I always love to say, like, when New Jack City came out, I said, well, that's an old Warner Brothers gangster movie, right? And Wesley Snipes is basically doing Jimmy Cagney
Exactly.
in the movie, right? And I find that that's just a fascinating way of getting younger people to connect with the history, not just of cinema, but the American history and world history at the same time. Although I wouldn't, I don't get your history from the movies, but it's a good way to entice them into looking a little deeper.
Yeah, and this is important, of course, because if we're not introducing younger generations to these old classic films, well, how are they going to sustain? How are they going to survive? We have to keep the allure alive, and thankfully it's folks like you and proselytizers like on TCM and elsewhere that are spreading the gospel of the merits of classic Hollywood cinema and the golden age of movies. It's a harder sell, let's be honest. Black and white isn't very appealing to younger viewers. A lot of the, as we talked about, kind of corny, silly situations, the musicals, the comedies, things like that. At least there is something in noir that they can kind of grasp onto. And as you said, you put it so well, it's kind of a gateway drug. So I guess there's some hope there, huh?
Oh, I think so. I mean, you're right. It is getting tougher. In some ways, it's getting tougher than ever. When I do my live shows, I see a full range of attendees, age-wise, gender-wise. So I really think that this notion that, the death of classic cinema, that, nobody's going to be watching it is grossly overstated. I don't find that at all. there's a certain segment of the media that is like pounding on that because they just need something to write. But from my perspective, I actually put on shows. I mean, in January, I'll do a show at the Castro Theater in San Francisco. That's a 1,400 seat venue. And we will fill it for old movies that a lot of these people have never even heard of. So, there is an audience that is still attuned to this stuff. I mean, look, on TCM, I mean, there they are. I mean, that's...
They're still
TCM
there.
is essentially, the gatekeeper of, this country's cinematic legacy. And when I do the festivals and for TCM, I see all ages attending those festivals.
Well, that's good.
It is not like, movies for old folks who, they don't make them like that anymore. That's not who's watching these movies, believe me.
Well, that's good to hear. Let me just finish the thought on this question. We'll move on here. But I think Double Indemnity, for my part, it's worth celebrating because it's arguably the finest example of noir ever made, with an unsurpassed pedigree. And you consider the collaborators, right? James M. Cain, the original author, Raymond Chandler and Billy Wilder collaborating on the screenplay. Cain and Chandler, I mean, two of the finest scribes of pulp or hard-boiled school. And then you've got quite possibly the best noir director in Wilder. And then you combine an unimpeachable cast. Barbara Stanwyck, has she ever been better? Edward G. Robinson, one of the greatest supporting roles I've ever seen here. And both of whom have rarely been better. So to me, it's earned its Diamond Anniversary accolades by virtue of being so classically representational of the classic noir period. A lot of historians will point to, let's say, between 41 and 58 as that classic noir kind of cycle. But it wasn't the first noir, as we kind of established, but it did kind of perfect or progress the genre, creating that kind of template, as we said, for so many others to follow. So these are all important points. I think it's also worthy of our attention and praise 75 years later, Eddie, because although we know how it's going to end right from the start, because it's kind of telling its story in flashback, it's the journey of these two doomed souls that proves, to me anyway, so captivating. Yes, it's a gripping and virtually airtight yarn. It proves decidedly satisfying in that context, but and you have these fascinating twists and turns along the way, the noose tightening around Neff's neck. But to me, the payoff is more in the behaviors and the tension felt between Neff and Dietrichson in particular, and also between Neff and Keyes. So, and again, as we talked about, it's so chock full of crackling, hard-boiled dialogue that is so savory and satisfying. You said that, that could either turn you off or you love it. I love it.
Eric, that was a great summation of the film. And I agree with every single word that you said. It's very interesting to note that James M. Cain did not write good dialogue.
That's right.
He wrote dialogue that was fine for the page, but he just did not have his lines didn't sing, and that's what Wilder saw in Chandler. When Joe Sistrom, actually the producer Joe Sistrom, is the one who said, well, you might want to think about this guy Chandler, because as I'm sure you know, Wilder's regular writing partner, Charles Brackett, begged off this film. He did not like the subject matter. He did not like the book at all. And he said, if you're doing this one, Billy, you're doing it without me. And, Wilder did not like to write alone. He wanted a partner to bounce everything off of. And that's why he brought in Chandler. And although they had a very acrimonious partnership writing this film, they were good for each other.
Yeah.
In terms of the creativity. And, that's Chandler's dialogue grafted onto the classic Cain plot, and it works brilliantly. And it's interesting to note that, Wilder was so gung-ho about making this film because he had gotten a reputation as sort of a protege of Ernst Lubitsch, and he did comedies, and he was funny. Correct, all true. But he really wanted to rival Alfred Hitchcock.
That's right.
Hitchcock had been doing these great suspense films and was kind of like becoming the king. He'd come over from England and like, here he is, taking control of Hollywood. And Wilder was like, I can do one of those too. But the real twist is that he was not perturbed in the least by the fact that the protagonists were so unsympathetic. A lot of the film's mordant humor I think, comes from Wilder amusing himself with the knowledge that the audience is going to root for these people.
Yeah.
Even though they're criminals. And, I think that he finds that fascinating, just, his understanding of human nature and cinema itself, because, Hitchcock was like that as well. When in Psycho, when Norman is sinking the car, it's like you want it to go under. And he's like, why? Why do I want this guy to get away with this,
You become complicit in the crime. That's Hitchcock playing you like a violin, of course.
Yeah. And I also, when you were talking about how great the film is, I don't want to overlook Fred MacMurray. I mean, he gives a really good performance in this film, which holds up. I mean, when I saw it the first few times, everybody my age has an issue because they relate to Fred MacMurray as the dad from My Three Sons, right? And it's kind of hard to get past that. But now, I haven't seen an episode of My Three Sons in 45 years or something. So now I think of Fred MacMurray as Walter Neff.
Yeah, it's kind of like the same phenomenon of, introducing, younger generations to, let's say, Forbidden Planet. And suddenly you see Leslie Nielsen, who you're used to in, like, Naked Gun movies, in this straight role, and
Right.
It's hard not to chuckle. But, hey, these folks had careers before television and, comedy movies and things like that. So I agree. Fred MacMurray, he really sells his performance quite well. And, the bonus feature on the DVD that you appeared in as well, they went into the detail of how every leading man in Hollywood didn't want any part of this. They didn't want to take that role of Neff, and so it was a little difficult to find somebody. But I think they hit on just the right look and the right kind of actor for this. He delivers those lines so well. I think it's his line delivery in particular, and kind of that poker face that he keeps that really helps MacMurray kind of define this character so well.
He just seems like the ultimate straight white man.
Yep,
of
absolutely.
The period, I mean, how can there be roiling evil in this guy,
Exactly. I mean, he strikes me as this slightly oily, salesman, a guy who's going to come on with a pitch, but he looks like your typical salesman, so it works for me, absolutely. So let's move on, Eddie. In what ways do you think Double Indemnity was influential on cinema and popular culture in any way, or set trends? Now, you started to talk about this a little earlier in terms of how this was a groundbreaking film. Would you like to elaborate or add some new points?
Well, I think that its main influence was that it made this type of story palatable. I think somewhere along the line I made the comment that, it presented the means, motive, and opportunity to commit murder, which was not something Hollywood movies did. I mean, they were in many ways expressly forbidden from doing that. And it did it in an incredibly entertaining way.
Yes.
Which changed everything. And then suddenly you saw all of these films. Now, I'm not going to say that Double Indemnity was alone in setting this trend, because, we're celebrating its 75th anniversary, but there were a number of other films that came out the same year that have 75th anniversaries, like Phantom Lady and Woman in the Window and Murder My Sweet. These were combined, the cumulative effect of all of these movies suddenly appearing at one time became kind of overwhelming. But there is no question that Double Indemnity was the spear tip, if you will, that really kind of tore the business apart and said, well, now you can make movies like this. And I really think that was a major part of Billy Wilder's motivation in making this film, is he loved challenging the status quo. He loved thumbing his nose at the production code.
Right.
That's who he was. That was his personality. And, so I think that was really the major influence this film had on cinema and changing people's ideas about what made for good entertainment. Honestly, that's I think its major contribution.
Yeah, all good stuff here. Let me chime in a little bit. So the research I gathered suggests that this is one of the first examples of a crime film told in overarching flashback form, wherein we begin at the end and are shown how we arrived there. Now, I don't know if that's actually accurate. Do you know for a fact, is this the first one to employ that structure?
No, I mean it might be the best, and you know it wasn't something that they understood immediately, because I do recall it being a big revelatory moment when Chandler and Wilder hit on the idea of the dictaphone, like
Okay.
that's how we're gonna establish his voiceover. Because you know Wilder didn't like the idea of him just having a voiceover out of nowhere. You know,
Yeah,
there had
right.
to be a reason for it.
Well, that makes for a unique combination, at least, maybe one not done before, where, okay, you have the kind of overarching flashback structure, but you combine it with the voiceover narration. And this is kind of a formula a lot of subsequent noirs would copy, right? Including Sunset Boulevard by Wilder just a few years later.
Yeah, well, it's not the first flashback, because the flashbacks all the way back in the 1930s, and you know.
No, I don't mean first flashback. I mean like a crime film told in like overarching flashback form. So yeah, you're right. I mean, we'd seen flashbacks before this.
It also borrows from crime fiction, because you know, although Double Indemnity is written in the third person, not the first person, all of Chandler's novels are written in the first person.
Interesting.
And it's not uncommon at all in noir fiction, particularly. Now, crime fiction, you find a lot of third-person narration, but noir fiction is usually told from one character's point of view, and it sort of represents their spiral into the dark side, right? So stuff like I Wake Up Screaming by Steve Fisher and these things. I mean, these are progenitors of all of this, and I don't think you can overestimate the significance of American crime fiction on the development of film noir.
Sure.
I mean, most of that great writing came in the 1930s, late 20s and 1930s, but they weren't adapting them to the screen
Yes.
yet, you know. And then in the 40s is when, well, now let's turn to this stuff and see what we can get out of it, you know. And remember that they were familiar with, Hollywood was familiar with Kane through The Postman Always Rings Twice, which MGM had bought when the book came out, but there was no way they could actually make it. And when Postman eventually was made at MGM in 1946, it was only after Billy Wilder showed you how to do it.
Right.
This is how you approach this material, right? Because in all honesty, Double Indemnity was Kane's attempt to cash in on The Postman Always Rings Twice, because it's kind of the same story.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you for the clarifications and the additional context. But just to kind of echo what you said earlier in answer to this question, Double Indemnity, it made noir a more accepted and respected genre, right? By virtue of it earning, as you said, strong box office, high critical acclaim. I think it earned 7 Academy Award nominations. So it's got a luster to it that suddenly, no, let's pay attention to more of these noirs, right?
Completely. And don't underestimate the significance of the actors in that sense, because you know Stanwyck was the highest paid actress in Hollywood. I think it was.
That's right.
It was she or Betty Davis went back and forth being the highest paid act. So the fact that she would do a project like this, and that Fred McMurray, who was a likable leading man in comedies and things.
And then you have the embarrassment of riches of Edward G. Robinson, who had never before done a supporting role, according to the DVD features I watched. He agrees to take a lesser role to appear in this quality production. So it all adds up to a great cast.
Totally agree. And never, that's a big thing with me, is never underestimate the significance of the performers, because that's what sells something to the public, right? You can talk all about the writing and the directing and everything, but in Hollywood movies, it's the performers that put it over. So when people say, what led to the creation of film noir, I always say, well, Humphrey Bogart. Because really it was his attitude and his style on screen that set the whole thing up.
But what's so interesting is he was not a known quantity, per se, in Maltese Falcon, which really was his breakthrough film. He had been kind of a side character, lackey, gangster, supporting dude in so many Warner pictures before that.
Mm-hmm. Where Cagney was the star, Edward G. Robinson was the star, and he was the second banana.
Exactly. So to your point is so valid that in Double Indemnity, by contrast to, let's say, Maltese Falcon, you have established big-name actors here who the audience is new, with the exception of perhaps Fred McMurray so much. But But again, there's a prestige to this picture that people know going into, right?
Absolutely, and I think that was all part of Wilder's plan. I mean, he really wanted Barbara Stanwyck to make this movie, and he knew that he was going to change things if he could get somebody of her stature to play a murderess in the film. And as I'm sure you know, she was quite nervous about it and didn't really want to do it. She's, Billy, it's going to kill my career. And of course, he famously said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you were an actress," and goaded her into doing it. And she and Fred MacMurray had made pictures before together. A fantastic one that I love called "Remember the Night."
Fantastic.
With a Preston
Sturges script, exactly.
Yeah, and then I think when Stanwyck said yes, then MacMurray was like, "Well, if she's in, I'm in," and there you go. And with those two, it was off to the races.
Just to kind of wrap it up in a bow, possibly more than any other film before it, you consider Double Indemnity, it demonstrates how sin, how avarice, lust, deceit, the thrill of attempting the perfect crime, how these things could entertain audiences and keep them coming back for more. This is already problematic in the production code era, and how do you get it past the censors, which is kind of a miracle that, based on what you said and what I've read here, that it got made at all. But Double Indemnity makes salacious subject matter more popular to moviegoers, right? I mean, you're depicting criminal, cold-blooded, and immoral acts with such forthrightness: murder for profit, infidelity, insurance swindling, the perfect crime, rotten, duplicitous behavior. Somehow Wilder and company got these ideas past the censors, and then what do you have after that? The dam seems to have burst. You get, as you said, Postman Always Rings Twice, Mildred Pierce, Scarlet Street, Lady from Shanghai, Out of the Past, etc., etc., etc. So this was really a dam breaker. Would you agree?
I would totally agree with that. And to me, I always felt that like the purpose of art was to show people, art is the lie through which we learn the truth. So said Picasso, right? But people don't want to be fed a line, And I really think that a major part of the movement, the noir movement in Hollywood, was that the studios had tried for so many years to bottle up all of these subjects. Like, with the production code, you can't do this, you can't show that, crime can't pay, husbands and wives don't sleep in the same bed. They were treating the American public like children, honestly. And here are all these artists who are saying, look, we're just trying to tell stories that are our reflection of the way life actually works and the way the culture works and the way people think and the way they behave. And so here Double Indemnity did this. It was a success. Suddenly the door that had cracked open is blown wide, and artists were thrilled to have this liberation where they could write a story in which the hero didn't have to win at the end. The hero didn't even have to be a hero. And I think the trying to put a lid on this for so long during the Depression, help America, boost the public's morale during the Depression. Then all of a sudden we're in World War II. We have to do our patriotic bit, And then all of a sudden, towards the end of World War II, that all goes out the window.
Yeah.
And I cannot stress enough how part of the movement was just artists feeling free and liberated to say, I want to write a story that ends badly. I want to write a story in which these characters are really compromised. And this is true of the actors who are like, I want to play those people. Cinematographers who were enticed by this. John, when talking about Double Indemnity, you cannot overlook the contribution of John Seitz, the cinematographer.
Yes.
The look of the film is fantastic. And even Stanwyck went out of her way to say his lighting helped her performance. She got to move between the light and the shadow, and she just felt the whole thing, the feel in the house, and when she was in Walter's apartment, how clandestine the whole thing felt. That, she really credited Seitz with helping her performance.
Yeah, talk about, influential. Just think about, this is a small point, but in terms of how the movie was influential, this could be the first instance of a noir that uses Venetian blinds and the suggestive shadows they create, right? I mean, you've got like the bar kind of shadows crossing Neff's face throughout the movie. And again, just the simple thing like those Venetian blind shadows, amazing.
I agree. I would say it's probably the first movie that used them so well and so effectively and so often. They certainly appear in other films earlier than this. When you go back and look at stuff from the 30s, early 30s, a lot of those pre-code movies had a lot of visual elements, much like film noir.
Interesting.
But it hadn't coalesced into a movement, and I just can't stress enough how I feel like there was something developing in that pre-code era that was very, very similar to what would come after World War II, but then they really cracked down, and in 1934, when they really truly enforced the production code, that it kind of stopped.
Right.
And then there were like 10 years where all of a sudden there really isn't anything that approximates noir. And then it starts to come out in Maltese Falcon and I Wake Up Screaming and This Gun for Hire, and then bang. Then all of a sudden Double Indemnity and all those other films I mentioned earlier come out in 1944, and then you have a full-scale movement.
Right. So let's dig in deeper, Eddie. What's the moral to the story here? What themes, messages, or motifs, for that matter, are explored in Double Indemnity?
A lot of these movies are tales of karma. You know, it's like you're not going to get away with it, which is, I think, how Wilder sold the whole thing. It's like, well, no matter what I'm doing in this film and what behavior we're showing and capitalizing on and making seductive, in the end, they're not going to get away with it. So, you know, I'm doing your job of convincing people that crime doesn't pay, and these, you know, it all leads to a big dead end. I mean, that's kind of the essential theme of noir, right?
Key's one-way trip to the cemetery monologue.
Exactly. But there you go. But Wilder knew that one-way trip to the cemetery could be really entertaining. And I think that's why these films have lasted so long, is because they're not moralizing necessarily. They're just telling you, this is what happens when you try to do this stuff. If you're going to kill, her husband, and you think you've got the perfect plot and everything, something's going to go wrong. I mean, if I have to apply a theme to Double Indemnity, my take on the film is I love it as a love story, but the love story is between the two guys.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's between Keyes and Neff, and it's a father-son relationship.
Right.
That goes really, really bad. So it's about betrayal. And everybody always talks about the betrayal of Walter and Phyllis, but the real betrayal is Walter and Barton Keyes.
Oh, the look on Robinson's face when he walks in at the end of the office and he realizes, wow, it was the guy closest to me. That's great.
Yeah, closer than you realize.
Exactly.
Keyes. It's kind of heart-wrenching in a way, which is, you kind of have to lean into it a little bit, because I certainly didn't see that the first few times I watched the movie. You're just kind of overwhelmed by Stanwyck, and I think a lot of people misinterpret what the film is about. They think it's a femme fatale story about a woman who leads a man down the road to ruin and all that, and it's like, oh no, this is about two rotten people who were perfectly capable of destroying themselves and each other, which is right there in the book. If you've read the Kane's novel, you know that the ending of the novel is so bizarre. Have you read the book?
No, but I heard it summarized in the bonus feature. I guess they
Suicide
commit suicide. That's right, suicide.
It's a suicide
pact.
pact,
Exactly.
and they are in fact getting away with it, and that's one of the interesting differences between the book and the movie. Is in the book, there is no justice, brought to bear on these people. They get away, and they're on a cruise ship to Mexico when they realize how completely rotten they are. and that the only possible thing for them is to die together. And there's a shark that's been following the ship, and they throw themselves overboard to be eaten by this shark. That's the end of the book.
Yeah, they couldn't have pulled it off for this.
No, there is no way that's getting in the movie version.
So the key theme to you is betrayal, right?
Absolutely. And the love story between Neff and Keyes is so much stronger in the screenplay than it is in the novel. And to me, that was the real genius that Wilder and Chandler brought to it, was emphasizing that aspect of the story.
Let me throw some themes by you here that I tried to kind of summarize a bit in my thoughts on the movie. How about the fallibility and corruptibility of human beings? So you got a picture here that serves as a cautionary tale in a way, depicting the ease with which, any person can be quickly tempted and tainted under the right circumstances. So consider how, quickly Neff, your average everyday insurance dude, not some two-bit hood, not some con man or gangster, consider how he agrees to collaborate with Phyllis on this murder scheme, and it's only after 3 conversations. Now, again, they couldn't show you that they probably had a lot of sex in between or right after or whatever, but it's insinuated, and if you look closely enough, you could figure that out. But still, the ease with which somebody could be seduced like that. Another theme, tell me your thoughts on this, the inability to escape one's doomed nature. So you have Neff and Phyllis, they seem predestined in a way to conspire and to fail, literally because the movie starts at the end after their plans backfire. So again, the inability to kind of evade one's predestined doomed nature. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a major theme in a lot of noir stories. I do think that in Walter's case, it's very interesting because he seems like a character who's just walking around with all of this crazy stuff inside of him that he's carrying around, and the possibility of being that terrorist, but he's looking for somebody to light the fuse.
Yeah.
And then he meets Phyllis, and it's like, oh, now I'm not alone in this. I have a conspirator. That, and noir is very often about meeting the last person on earth you should ever meet.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Because that's exactly what happens. It's like, that fuse got lit, and now things are going down a path that we never anticipated. Or I'm sorry, it's going down a path that we did anticipate, that we dreamed about and thought about, but we never acted on until we meet that person who is the wrong one for us, right? Or the perfect one for us, right? And that's, to me, that's a big part of the story. Phyllis is a little more of a cipher in the movie because we're clearly meant to understand that she had pulled something, because she was her husband's nurse, or, his first wife's nurse at one point. And there's a suspicion that she actually killed the wife to get into the household and get the guy's money and all this stuff. But it's all just alluded to. There's nothing in the movie that really spells that out. And you're never quite sure what her motivation is beyond the kind of generic security that the femme fatale is always after, right? She's really not that interested in sex. She just wants the security.
That's right. But I love that, Eddie, because, again, the story is being told completely, I should say, through Neff's point of view. So we learn the truth as he does. And it's good to me anyway that we don't know what's spinning around in Phyllis's head, and we get revealed the twist. Suddenly, it's Bruno Zucchetti and she are collaborating against Neff, and maybe you didn't see that coming, and it's just a kind of delicious twist there. So maybe she did kill the first wife. All these things start to unravel, and we uncover it as Neff does, and I think that's good. But
No,
what about...
I completely agree, because again, that's a part and parcel of noir, is that most of the best noir stories are told from one character's point of view. There is no balance. There's no attempt to, show compelling motivations for all the characters. It's just there's something about the scariness in noir of never being able to know another person. You don't really know what their motivations are. You don't know what makes them tick. So Phyllis becomes an instrument of Walter's demise in this story, and he never really knows what she's about.
No question about it. I do want to dovetail back to what you were talking earlier about Neff. The hubris of pride and arrogance is another possible theme. Consider that Neff, he thinks his plan is foolproof. He thinks his insider cleverness demonstrates a superiority over lesser criminals who didn't get away with their supposedly perfect crimes. But what happens? He's undone in the end by what Keyes predicts. He can't get off that trolley ride and leave Phyllis behind. And yet, even at the very end, he maintains this kind of smug self-satisfaction that he had kept Keyes from figuring out that it was his office mate who actually did it. So arrogance and pride is another theme explored here.
Absolutely.
And how about the dangers of veering from the straight and narrow path? I couldn't help but notice on my subsequent viewing last night of the movie for the umpteenth time that Phyllis says, it's you and me straight down the line, give or take a word or two there. But she says it like 4 or 5 times.
That is a common line.
Yeah, so what is this telling us about the story? Why that repeated line? To me, it can be assumed that Neff was supposedly a relatively honest salesperson, but as you said, maybe a ticking time bomb waiting, maybe a terrorist in one sense. But he needed Phyllis to kind of ignite that trigger, if you will, as you said. But he goes off that straight and narrow path. He chooses the twisted route of crime hand in hand with Dietrichson. And ironically, she keeps telling him, it's you and me straight down the line, only their new course is leading them, as Keyes predicts, straight to the cemetery. So I think that kind of works in terms of the context of that line. And lastly, as far as a theme to explore here, and we can move on, but the dual natures of men and women. So the filmmakers, they cleverly use the low-key lighting to manifest shadows. You see Neff's shadow a lot. You see his silhouette. It seems, in some scenes, it almost seems like that shadow or silhouette is capable of overtaking him, of pushing him out of the frame. To me, that kind of insinuates like an irreversible turn to the dark side of his nature. And we also get plenty of doppelgangers and twinning and doubles in Double Indemnity. Not just the title, but like you think about the undefined man on the crutches we see at the opening credits. That could be, Phyllis's husband? It could be Walter. The contrasting characters of the first and second Mrs. Dietrichson. The 2 male saps in Walter and Zacchetti. The pairing of Keyes and Neff, who exhibit, chemistry and camaraderie. So there's a lot of doubling going on in the movie, too, right?
Yeah, I mean, I find that to be a somewhat, I don't want to say common, but it is that pops up regularly in noir. And I mean, you've hit on it. It is like the duality of our nature, right? We go through life acting one way when we're really feeling a different way, and do we act on these impulses or not? There's a beautiful shot in the scene where Walter and Phyllis first meet. That this is the scene I always show, young people when I'm trying to get them interested in old movies, and they understand the symbolism when Walter starts talking and Phyllis clearly is pondering, can I use this guy to kill my husband? And the shot is she's kind of pacing next to the fireplace and her shadow stretches out ahead of her so prominently in the frame that it becomes her inner self. It's like This is her dark inner self is emerging and elongating as she walks by the fireplace. And it is the perfect representation of what's going on inside her. That stuff is done throughout the movie. And again, that's why Wilder, he is the best writer-director, in my estimation, in the history of Hollywood.
Wow.
Because he had such an incredibly great grasp of the language, even though it was not his first language.
Yeah.
And had just a visual storytelling skill that was second to none. I mean, his integration of language and visual is as good as anybody ever to make movies.
Well put.
And then he shows it again when he does Sunset Boulevard. I mean, all of his movies are good, but those 2 movies are off the charts good.
Yeah, no question about it. Eddie, this is a birthday celebration, and a big part of any birthday party is getting presents, right? But I contend that it's the fans who continue to get the gifts from these old movies. So what do you think? What is Double Indemnity's greatest gift to viewers?
I've shown this film numerous times to live audiences, and I think that for a live audience, the greatest pleasure in the movie is the language. They absolutely love the dialogue. The meeting scene with the, why don't you get down off your motorcycle and write me a ticket, there's a speed limit in this state, Mr. Neff. This is, I think this captivates newer audiences to the film because it's so unlike the way dialogue is written today. And like I said at the top, some people aren't going to get it, but I just think the language is so spectacular in this movie. I think that Edward G. Robinson's dialogue is so phenomenal. Margie sounds like she drinks from the bottle. There's just so many great one-liners in this film.
You're not smarter, Walter. You're just a little taller. That's
just a little taller. Yeah, I think that's the takeaway these days, is that people just fall in love with the language.
Sure.
I mean, everything else we've talked about is obviously a huge part of it.
Sure.
But if I had to single out one thing that stands head and shoulders right now that is unique to the film, it would be the language.
My answer to this question is, I believe its greatest gift is its ability to tell such a compelling story with relatively simple elements. Now, I say that with caveats. This is a pretty crunchy plot. I mean, it's a winding, twisty story. It's maybe not as convoluted as like The Big Sleep or something like that, but we aren't shown a sexy, torrid, illicit affair, and they were limited in that sense, but we don't see a lot of smoldering kisses and oozing sexual chemistry scene in, scene out. I mean, the actual intimacy between Neff and Phyllis is limited here. And Walter doesn't talk about needing the money to get out of a jam. He doesn't fantasize about what he's going to do with the money or the life he and Phyllis will supposedly live together once they're, in the clear. So that begs the question to me, what is Walter in this for if it's not for love, sex, or money? I remember reading Roger Ebert's review of this movie. Retroactively, he gave it a great movie review years later. He said that both are attracted not so much by the crime as by the thrill of committing it with the other person. Love and money are pretenses. And I think he's right. So to me, instead of being primarily a film about the allure of temptation, to me it's a picture about the 3 Ds: doom, dread, and deceit. And you watch how rapidly Walter and Phyllis's relationship starts to disintegrate, that brooding paranoia and the fear that Neff is engulfed by. You consider the tightening knot twisting around his neck, the ever-encroaching presence of Keyes. He's sniffing closer and closer. That's, to me, what makes Double Indemnity so special. And watching it, I don't know about you, Eddie, but I can't help but ask myself, what would I have done in that situation if I were Neff? If I got myself in this deep, if I got seduced by her, what could I do? How could I keep Keyes and the police off my back? I always put myself in Walter's shoes and I shudder because I know he's screwed. And yet I can't help but sympathize with him and experience the fear and the doubt that he lives through. So I think, to me, that's the greatest gift. There are so many other great gifts, but to me, that's the one that stands out.
That's great. I couldn't hear my footsteps, Keyes. It was the walk of a dead man.
That's the best line in the movie to me. You can't get better than that.
Yeah.
Let's cut to the chase. Is this the greatest film noir ever, in your opinion? And second question, is Phyllis Dietrichson, so wonderfully played by Barbara Stanwyck, is she the finest of all femme fatales? What would you say?
I think without question it is the most essential film noir. You asked, was it the greatest? I think greatest is completely in the eye of the beholder. I know some people would say, Out of the Past is the greatest, or Touch of Evil, or Kiss Me Deadly, or, at a certain point it becomes a personal thing. I mean, my favorite film is In a Lonely Place, but that's just because I relate to those characters more than I relate to the characters in Double Indemnity. But in my mind, there is no question that Double Indemnity is the essential film noir. It is definitive and it is essential. I would prefer to use, when I talk about it, I use those terms more than the greatest film noir.
I respect that. Yeah, what about Phyllis then?
I would say the same thing about her. Your femme fatales, let's face it, guys, when they watch these movies, so many men, for so many years, have related to film noir almost exclusively in these are stories about femme fatales. These are stories about women who destroy men. Like, there's something in it for these men that's how they relate to the whole movement, the genre, whatever you want to call it. And I've always said, there doesn't have to be a femme fatale for it to be noir. That's just the best ones have the femme fatale. And in many ways, it's people reveal themselves in in the femme fatales that they choose. And I have heard so many people overlook Stanwyck's performance in this movie because they don't think she's sexy in the way that Ava Gardner is sexy in The Killers, or Rita Hayworth in Lady from Shanghai, you know?
Or Gene Tierney and Laura or something like that.
Yeah. And she's got the wig.
Right, the cheap wig.
Right? And the wig is a deal breaker for a lot of people, right? But I kind of love the wig because it's such a great reveal of the character, like how no matter what house she's living in or where, she's cheap. She's cheap.
Exactly. And synthetic.
I love her performance. There's stuff that Stanwyck does in this movie that is the best ever for playing this type of evil woman. I love at the end when they're in the embrace and she tells Walter, just this minute I realize I actually love you. And it's like she sells that line. And it's like you don't have any idea whether she's just trying one last ditch effort to con him,
yes,
or whether she's real. I mean, is she real? Is this what she wanted all along? Was a guy to like plug her? That's where she finds love. It's really a remarkable performance. I would have no hesitation saying yes, she is the femme fatale of all time in these movies. But granted, that is a subjective thing because people have their own attitudes about such things, right? Do you like Bogart or do you like Robert Mitchum or do you like Fred McMurray?
Right. No, I appreciate your honesty and all the context you provided there. So before we say goodbye, is there anything you're currently working on, either with TCM or outside of TCM, maybe a forthcoming book, for example, that listeners should check out?
There are many, many things on my plate right now. So much so that it gets a little scary at times. But I'm happy to say I've just scheduled another season of Noir Alley on TCM.
Fantastic.
We've, plugged in all the films. I'm excited about that. I just signed a contract to do a revised and expanded edition of my original film noir book called Dark City: The Lost World of Film Noir.
Terrific.
So that will be coming out in a year or so, I think. I also just signed a contract to do a book. We don't know who's doing this yet, but called The Bogart Style, which is all about Humphrey Bogart as an icon of American style. Not a biography of Bogart. It's really just looking at him and what he meant to style in the movies and in life.
Sounds great.
Very excited about doing that. And there's all sorts of other stuff. There's a screenplay I'm not going to talk about that I'm working on, and a novel that I'm halfway through that has been waiting for 10 years to be completed. So third in a series of crime fiction novels. So yeah, it's a lot of stuff. And then there's all those intros that I do for TCM, right? I got to write those too.
Absolutely. Wow. That is quite a full plate. I hope with all that activity you have a good insurance policy in place in case anything happens.
Yeah, and I got to be careful of who I run into out there,
Right, exactly.
The last person you want to meet.
Stay away from those women who wear the ankle bracelets and the perfumed hair.
That's my audience. So I can't stay too far away from them.
Well, this was such a treat, Eddie. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for agreeing to be a guest on Cineversary.
Eric, it was absolutely a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I hope we get a chance to do it again sometime.
Dynamite stuff there from Eddie Muller. Again, I'm pinching myself that I actually landed the biggest fish in the noir pond. Thanks again, Eddie, for saying yes. Time now for standing ovations. Now, this is where I give a shout out to a movie, book, website, TV program, podcast, or other work that I think would be of interest to classic film lovers. So my standing ovation for November is a podcast. It's called the Nostalgia Digest Podcast, a monthly show by Steve Darnell, who hosts Those Were the Days, a weekly radio program in Chicago that for the past 50 years has presented the very best in old-time radio. Shows like The Jack Benny Program, The Shadow, Suspense, Gunsmoke, Fibber McGee and Molly, and so many others. Steve's podcast pays tribute each month to a different icon from the golden age of entertainment, such as, most recently, Lionel Barrymore, you've got Groucho Marx, Doris Day, Ronald Colman, Al Jolson. There's a whole bevy of stars featured in 2019. Each show usually features an interview with a special guest as well as several clips or a full old-time radio show starring that month's spotlight star. It's a lot of fun and a chance to pay propers to celebrities and programs that made the golden age of radio, that's the 30s, 40s, and 50s, so entertaining. Also, you can hear a streaming recording of the past 2 weeks' worth of Steve's Those Were the Days radio program by visiting nostalgiadigest.com and clicking on the Those Were the Days tab at the top of the page. Highly recommended stuff. Well, that wraps up another installment of Cineversary. If you like what you've heard, hey, leave me a positive review on whatever platform you get this podcast from. It really helps this show get discovered by new listeners, and it grows our audience. Much appreciated. Do you want to suggest a future movie due to celebrate an anniversary that we should consider devoting an episode to? Maybe you have a burning question for me? Maybe you just want to offer some suggestions or comments? Well, you can get a hold of me, Eric Martin, at cineversegroup@gmail.com. You can also visit my website, which is cineversegroup.com. That's the portal for my Cineverse film discussion group that I launched 14 years ago and which continues to meet weekly in the South Suburban Chicago area. We're a democratic film society that watches and then discusses a predetermined movie that our members pick on a rotating basis. At cineversegroup.com, and that's spelled CINEVERSE group.com, you can hear podcast recordings of our group discussions and read more about the films we study. Wow, hard to believe, but December is nearly here, right? So that's when we'll turn our attention to probably the most watched film in movie history. Can you guess what it is? Of course, it's the beloved Wizard of Oz, released in 1939 and enjoying an 80th anniversary in 2019. I hope you can join us for that special celebration. This has been your humble host, Eric Martin, reminding you to butter up that popcorn, live a big screen surround sound life, and of course, cherish those classic movies. Because, hint, hint, they're not getting older, they're just getting better. Thanks again for giving us a listen.